Welcome to Wisdom Journey. This is the show where we talk about how people actually build clarity, leverage, and results in real life, not theory, not buzzwords, not vanity wins. Today's guest is someone who lives at the intersection of data, decision making, and growth. Kuber Jain is a senior data scientist who has led analytics, engagement, and retention efforts at companies like Headspace, Sana, DocuSign, and Optimizely. Over the years, his work has helped drive product growth and generate millions in measurable business impact. What I love about Kuber's work is that he doesn't just analyze number. He helps teams decide what matters and what to ignore and what to act on. In this conversation, we're talking about how data actually shapes better decisions, how to avoid being distracted by vanity metrics, and how founders, creators, and operators can use simple thinking frameworks to move faster and smarter. Welcome to the podcast, Kuba.
Thank you, Wisdom, for the warm introduction.
Yeah. From how to you've worked with as I said earlier on in the intro with companies where every decision has real financial and human consequences. At what point
Mhm.
did you realize that data is less about numbers and more about decision making?
Yeah, I think I've been in this space for over a decade now, and I started my career being like an engineer who started just like got into a software company and then started a job. But while I was doing that, I realized there's like passion towards like crunching numbers, and hence I decided to do my graduation from United States. And since then, I've been very close with this field of data and analytics. And to specifically answer your question, many people think that data is just about numbers, but it's much more than that. And the reason I say that is like it's very easy to like do 1 + 2 = 3, right? But that's not how data
Yeah,
works, right? It's about like you know how do you come to that number? Like how do you balance both side of the equation in terms of like making sure that whatever data insights you pull, you're able to communicate that to stakeholders, and how that insights actually help inform companies to like a decision where they can plan their strategy or growth based on the insights that the data tells it, right? So it's like okay, it's not like a mathematics, but it's more like hey, how do you convey your insights to your stakeholders? How do you influence your stakeholders in terms of whatever data you pull, and then in the end, like how those insights actually tie to your company objectives? So making sure that whatever work you are doing, it's not like garbage in, garbage out, but more like how it actually ties to the overall company's objectives. And then using those insights, how companies able to like influence the strategy, roadmap, decisions. Um, and while doing so, making sure that your company is more moving towards more like data literacy, where not slowly in terms of like where people can actually understand data, what does specific metric represents, and how to use that metric for the company-wide decisions.
well, Ellie, you talked about a lot of people misinterpret what data analytics is all about. Early in your career,
Uh,
what did you misunderstand about data that you see many smart people still getting wrong today?
yeah, I think to start with, I did not had like an expectation of like how it would look like, uh, or how it would not land in terms of like when I think about my career. I think for me, it's just more about like the passion to be closer to this field and gain exposure via working with different SaaS companies, right? So when I look at my career journey, I started with being like more in technical role in my first company, and then moved to like more business side of things in terms of just like uh, trying to understand the organization, like the data, how data can be used in terms of like making decisions, right? So that entail like coming up with certain metrics. So back at DocuSign, I came up with this like a health metric that actually helped DocuSign understand how healthy their customer is in terms of like using the product, right?
Yeah.
That score was just like a score on a scale of 0 to 100, but eventually it basically helped leadership gain insights on like, okay, how healthy the customer base is, like how they're adopting to the product. And then based on that, you can like actually segment your customers and have different strategies for each of those customers. Like
Well,
a customer could be at churn risk, a customer could be healthy, or a customer might not be using a product, right? So then you need to come up with different playbooks to be able to target those specific segment of customers and work with your sales or success team to be able to like drive that conversation forward in terms of like uh, doing a lot of conversation with customer and trying to understand like what their use case is and how can they as a company like help them use the product better and also help them move in a direction where um, they find the value of the product.
well, um, a lot of people track metrics, but
Uh,
very few usually act on them. What's the difference between data-informed teams and teams that are just collecting dashboards?
yeah, great question. I think it ties back to the earlier thing that I was saying. Like, there's like one part where uh, you have like a lot of dashboard being built, and I've built myself a lot of dashboards,
Yeah,
and most of them just it's like a garbage in, garbage out because like whenever you join a new company, it's mostly like, oh, we don't have certain metrics that to be able to understand our business. So the first thing that I end up doing is like, oh, work with leadership team and just trying to get what metric would be helpful, right? And then how can we report on those metrics to be able to better understand the business? That's one part, right? But then what happened most of the times is basically depending on where the stage of what the state of the company is, it's sometimes like every stakeholder requests for different kind of dashboard. But then when you see over time, it's very important to look at like how those dashboard being used, right? Uh, if and you need to be very mindful of like whether the dashboard is just like um, a one-time request or is it like ongoing reporting that some company needs to be able to report on their quarterly business reports or like annual planning, things like that. Um, so the other side of is like making data informed decision. I think um, you need to first find your North Star metric, like how one metric that basically gives you overall gauge of the company health as like a your North Star, and then
yeah,
being able to have like certain driver metrics beneath that to be able to see like, okay, now I have like let's say a monthly active users, right? Of those, like how many are free users, how many are paid users, right? And then you can just keep going level down to understand like, okay, now I have paid users, what is my retention of my paid user base? So at a high level you need to just think of like a one or two North Star metric, and then you can just double down on like secondary driver metrics that helps you gain insights on um, making your organization move towards more data informed.
well, in your experience, why do teams fall in love with dashboards instead of decisions?
Yeah, I think a dashboard is just like a stop shop to be able to, it's like a format, I would say, where like teams or leadership wants to like see all your metrics and numbers because uh, it's not just dashboard, right? It's also like you have a lot of data in the Google Sheets that says, right? And then sometimes it becomes very complicated to be able to present that Google Sheet to a leadership meeting. So I think the one use case of dashboard is just more like, okay, we want to have everything in one place where we have the right source of data. We want to make sure that the data is captured getting correctly and the data is flowing in and getting refreshed on a consistent basis. Right? So that's like one format of that we as a data team think about like when presenting our numbers, which is dashboard. But then eventually what needs to happen is to be able to like how can leadership team or your stakeholders act upon on those insights that they get from the dashboard. I think that's very important and that feeds back to your earlier question on making data informed decisions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You've mentioned the danger of vanity metrics before. What are some of
Uh,
the common metrics people obsess over that don't actually move the needle?
yeah, great question. I think it depends on like what kind of business the company is in, right?
Yeah.
For specifically for us, like we look at monthly active users around like a default uh, metric because it's very easy to understand to be able to like make sure our leaders understand like what active means and then gives you high level understanding of like do do I have how my monthly active users are over time, like are they growing or are we seeing a decline year on year, right? So that's very simple metric. um, and then the other part of it is has to be like uh, how your metric needs to be much simpler to understand it doesn't have to be like very complicated, right? Like some percentage of users like with who took more than 2 actions in last 14 days. So you're adding like a lot of granularity here. It might be a good metric for certain teams who is owning like a user experience part, right? But from leadership standpoint of view, I think your metric needs to be like simpler and uh, directional enough to be able to provide some insights of how the company is doing.
Yeah, it needs to be simple enough, but directional
Yeah.
enough that it provides insights of how the company is doing. And
Yeah.
we're talking about vanity metrics. I realize that most times vanity metrics it quietly harms the team because it gets them to focus on the wrong metrics instead of what is actually productive. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's why like whenever we think of like metric as such, we need to have like a format of like decision tree where you have like your North Star metric,
yeah,
and then with the North Star metric, you branch out into like, for example, I was telling like you have monthly active users, you can just drill down to like your free users and paid users. With
yeah,
paid users, you can just look at like how many are how many of those users are actually converted from free trial to paid, and how many of them are like direct purchases. So you need to think of as like a decision tree, and so that it becomes very easy to understand like, okay, how your North Star metric is tied to like certain secondary metrics, and how a movement in one of those metrics at the bottom can actually impact your North Star metric, right? So you need to think and visualize it as more like a decision tree format where you build it in a manner where it is simple but also give you flexibility to be able to like drill down and investigate just in case any issues occur, or like the leadership wants to understand like, okay, what exactly is going on if we see a declining trend or an increasing trend.
oh yeah. I like that. When you join a team, right? You've worked with some big companies in the past, Headspace, DocuSign, etc. When you join a company, when you join a team, a business, um, or you look at a product, what are the first signals you look for to understand what truly matters?
Yeah, I think whenever I join a company, I think the first thing to just look at uh, get a look at feel of the product, right? Because it's very uh, something not naturally comes to your mind. It's you always talk about like, okay, what technology my team is using, um, who are my stakeholders are. But I think to start with, the very basic thing needs to be like, okay, have I used that app, right? Like, so let's say if you
Yeah,
join a new company, so like Headspace, I need to just get a feel of that app as a user to be able to see like, am I able to relate to my end users? Because if you're not able to connect and relate to the end users, then you'll not be able to find solutions to their problems that they face, right? It could be related to user experience, it could be related to like navigating from one part of the app to the other app, or it could just be like uh, a certain type of content not playing or well, or there's certain lag, right? Or maybe your app crashes, right? So it's very important for you, if you need to solve users problem, then you need to first experience it yourself, so you get to understand like, okay, how my overall journey looks like, and then built on thinking about like, okay, what metrics I need to think about, and how those metrics can support different teams, and how that ties to my overall key objectives.
well, yeah, I like that. You want to use the product yourself and just get a feel for it, rather than
Yep.
because sometimes when data is being transferred, when you're like, oh, what do you think of the product? Sometimes people
Mm.
put in their bias and their opinions, and then eventually when it gets to you, you're like, oh, well. Um, when you're working with large data sets, how do you filter signal from noise?
Great question. I think, yeah, in this being in this space, I think it's very common to, especially with larger data sets, it's very common to like have signal and noise mixed in your data, right? I think the first part is just to like understand the source of your data and where it comes from, right? And then see like what kind of fields or columns you need from that source to be able to make sure that like for example, it's a Salesforce, right? Like if you getting data ingested from Salesforce to your data lake, right? And if you talk about any object, right, you might get like hundreds and hundreds of fields, right? But not all the fields would be relevant to you, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's very important to, like, as an analyst, think about like, okay, what fields are important for me, right? And then once you drill down, and then once you have selected those fields, right, you need to do some kind of exploratory analysis to understand, like, okay, are there certain columns where all the values are missing, or are there certain columns where you see like weird random values that doesn't make sense. And then on those observation you build like a kind of some rules around that, like a data quality rules, so that it gives you like an alert every single day to see like, okay, whenever I log in every morning, like my total number of customers should be greater than zero. It's a very simple example, right? um, so if it fails, that means there is an issue or something broke in your upstream tables. So then you need to investigate, work with the data engineers on like, okay, why is that the case? So it comes around like establishing some data quality frameworks, um, and doing like a check, and then making sure that once you have the data, I think once you build your data quality framework or engine rules, I think you will be able to separate most of like the noise from the actual signal, and then you can just use that to do your analysis.
Hey, quick break. Before we continue, I'd love for you to join the Wisdom Journey newsletter. Every week, I share exclusive insights, tools, and behind the scenes updates to help you stay ahead in your own journey of building an online business. It's simple, practical, and built to help you grow. Sign up today for free at the link in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, and earlier on you talked about the North Star metric, and if someone like, I want you to look at the numbers, I want you to crunch the numbers, I want you to analyze everything, do some data analytics and all that. Before you look at the numbers, what questions do you usually ask the business owner uh,
Mhm.
before you even say, okay, yeah, now give me the numbers, let's start some work.
Yeah, I think great question. So before I start working, before I just look at or get interested about like the data itself, I think the first thing is like what problem this particular thing is going to solve for, right? Like, and how, because I think most of the time your stakeholders are not aware of what they actually want. So it's
Yeah,
very essential to spend up some time in the beginning, as you start working on those projects, to be able to sit with your stakeholders and deeply understand like the root on like what they're trying to solve for, right? And then once you have a clear understanding of that, you just work, being in this space, like what kind of data sources are available, mm, and then how using those sources you can build a solution for your stakeholders, right? So that comes from like, okay, maybe I don't have like two other data sources that I need for that problem. So in that case, communication becomes very important, um, in terms of like just saying your stakeholders that, mm, sorry, I just have like this source of data, but I don't have like two
yeah,
different other sources that I need. So this might not be possible. So you're phasing out a project in a way where you have like a milestone at every stage, like phase one, phase two, phase three. And with every milestone that you complete, you send out a communication with stakeholders and also share with them in terms of like what the roadblockers were, and kind of come up with a rough project plan to be able to like share, to help them understand like how the scope of the project is going to look like. And the other questions could be just around like, hey, how, so what is the problem I'm solving for? How it can make your life easier? How does it tie to like the overall company objectives and KRs? And how often do you need support this on? Like, is it just like a one-time ask, or is it something that you need it on a regular cadence? Because that becomes a conversation of like whether it should be a dashboard or just like a simple SQL logic that needs to be built. Um, and then just like more looking forward, just like how do you enable their team to be able to understand this metric? So it's more about like education, training, things like that.
well, uh, have you in your past work, have you ever had instances where the data was technically correct, but it still led to the wrong decision?
Let's see, data is correct, but still led to wrong decisions. Yes, I think so. I think in one of the examples I was sharing at DocuSign, where I was coming up with this customer health metric. So
Yeah.
um, because I was leading this project from end to end, I did have visibility on like what kind of different data sources I need. But while building that health score, one component of that was kind of engagement. And that was like way when I was early in my career and didn't knew like what metrics would could be a good component of that health score. So as an engagement component of that metrics, thought of having like number of support ticket as an engagement metric, on the hypothesis that if the customer create more support tickets, they'd be more healthier. But um, I think upon learning from my iterations of that particular health score, I realized that it is not true. Just because if customers are creating more tickets, that means they actually have a problem with the product. It could be a password reset issue, it could be a login issue, or it could just be they're not onboarded correctly. So in that case, uh, I need to work backwards in terms of just thinking what could be a better engagement metric, right? But definitely that number of support ticket was not the right engagement metric, even though like the data was correct. Um, and that kind of actually helped me learn on like, okay, uh, because that was like the first time something like this was done in the history of company. So it was more like coming up with something and then reiterating upon the next versions. Um, so in that particular scenario, data was correct, but I mistakenly came up with a metric that did not fit in there. But eventually, I fixed it in terms of like looking engagement more of like, okay, how recent a customer engaged with our product, and then having that as a measure of customer and not the support ticket.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Kuba. Um, when you're a data scientist, most of the things you're working on, they're technical, right? How do you explain data insights to leaders who don't have technical backgrounds but still need to make high stakes decisions?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, right, it's not about just numbers. It's also about like how you present your numbers and how you're able to influence your stakeholders. Right. So when it comes to like sharing insights with non-technical stakeholders, it's very important to set a context on just giving them like whatever you're presenting, like what's the reasoning or what's the context behind that problem that you're solving for, to make sure that everyone in the room is on the same page. um, and then basically it just like I think it's more of a art than a science in terms of just like how do you present those insights on like using your visuals correctly or translating certain technical terms to more simpler languages. Um, and then being able to have a structure around your story, right? In terms of just like, okay, now you've set up a context. What is the objective? Like, what are some of the key insights from this presentation? And then having the right slide for those summary slides, and then also making sure that you have certain additional slice of the data in appendix as in your back pocket to be able to like make sure that you did your thorough analysis from end to end, and just have everything ready in terms of any question comes up in the middle of time. Hey, do you look at segment XYZ? Because we thought that it could influence your insights, things like that. So having those kind of like a mindset in terms of like how do you structure your presentation and then communicating that with your stakeholders is important.
What's the cost of delaying decisions while waiting for more data?
Hmm. I think it's very subjective because it depends on like how mature your company is in terms of data infrastructure, right? Because yes, you have generally we have like so many projects that run on parallel, but sometimes if you don't have the data, you don't have it, right? Like you cannot just like ask your data engineer to just turn the magic wand and bring a new data source right away. Um, so I think that actually just depends on just having like right priorities and road mapping for your quarter or for next fiscal year, so that like every connected team is aware of what they need to work on, and then there's never a scenario where you need to wait for data because you already planned for it in advance. And if that's not there in roadmap, and these then we that means it was not the priority at all. In that case, you have to just like think about you communicate that to stakeholders that this was not a priority that we identified last quarter, and then maybe we need to work some plan in between where we think of this as like a solution that we could tackle next year.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, the cost could vary, like depend again, like how mature data organization is in your company. Uh,
yeah.
okay.
Well, you've worked with a lot of companies to help them with retention. And what's one retention insight that most people completely misunderstand?
Yes, I think retention, when people think of, is like retention is not an input; it is actually an output.
Okay.
So when people say like, "Oh, we can improve retention," that's incorrect. You cannot not actually improve your retention. You need to improve your activation, meaning like how you get your users on board in your product. You have to increase your users' engagement of your product. And when you have your activation and engagement working together hand in hand, that will automatically translate to your users being retained. So retention is always the output. It's never the input. So it's very misleading to say you can improve retention. Like in a way where you have to improve activation and engagement to be able to improve retention. It's not the
Yeah.
other way around where, you know, retention is never a lever by itself, right? You need to think about like different engagement strategies or activation strategies.
Yeah. Why do so many teams focus on acquisition? Why ignoring retention, even when retention is cheaper and even more
Mhm.
powerful?
Yeah, I think that's how the natural tendency is, because we have a lot of subscription products in the market, right? And everyone wants to get a big user base, right? uh, that's where everyone is like so focused on activating users, which is true. But then you also need to make sure that the majority of those users are not tire kickers. It's not just like, okay, they just come into your product um, once a month, depending on how what the frequency of your product is, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but very to put in a very simple words, like of course everyone wants to start with like a very high number of user days, and then how those users actually engage with the product, how those users convert to your like paid subscriptions. I think there's like a whole user journey that comes into picture in terms of like, okay, you have X users, you have Y free users, and then you have Z like paid users, but not you're not will not be able to retain like all users for sure, right? So then you need to think of like uh, how you can retain them, right? And there are like different strategies that you need to work off in terms of like how you can keep certain users engaged more and more. And you could put it again, there are like various engagement strategies. It could be through like notifications, it could be just like setting up reminders, or just sending them like a marketing or emails to be able to say like, hey user, we have not seen you in a while, like, uh, if you just log into your product, you'll see we have launched some new features. So making sure like how you bring your users back into your product. um, and I think the differentiator becomes retention, because it's very easy to acquire users. Like not easy as easy, but more like uh, your point. It's easy. Like everyone is focused on activating users, but I think retention is becomes like the sole driver. Where if you're not able to retain your users, then eventually your graph will just like going goes down the hill, and either you'll be stuck with like maybe like 1 to 5% of your overall users, which would just be like retained, right? So eventually like you need to think of um, retaining those users, because then eventually what happens is it's easier to retain your existing users than to bring in no more users over a period of time, right? There's only so much of new users you can bring in, right? So that's why retention becomes very critical. And whether you look at like either subscription metric or a revenue metric, you need to split that by like what percentage of that comes from new users versus your right retained users.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes like a very essential driver for like a successful business.
Oh, a lot of the the in terms of retention, one of the things they recommended is personalization. And my question is, how do you balance personalization at scale without losing
Mhm.
the human element?
Great question. This is actually something that we are working on in our current. Uh, so Headspace is an app. Like we do have like some standardized content for almost all of the users. Just that like based on how you have engaged with our app, it just shows you like the content which you have already engaged with. But we are yet to move in a direction where we make it more personalized, right? So I think personalization at scale is very critical in today's world with uh, everyone is going towards the AI route, right? You have like a lot more new tools coming in, a lot more subscription apps. Uh, so personalization is something that we truly think of in terms of like using personalization as a lever to bring making sure that users engage with us, right? Um, and then with personalization, like we do have like users history on how they interact with our app, right? So this is something that we are working towards in terms of like instead of having like a set content that the user can play, how can we come up with some more interactive or like more dynamic content that actually solve for user needs, right? Whether the user is suffering from stress or anxiety or depression, things like that. And instead of showing like standard like sleep, meditation or like breathing exercise, things like that. So I think personalization at scale in today's world is very critical, and it's very like something that we are actually working towards. We haven't not nailed it yet, but that is something in the direction that we want to go for going forward.
Oh, I know we talk about data and we talk about the importance of data, but how do you personally decide when data should lead the decision versus when your intuition or experience should just take over?
I think then it comes becomes like a problem of just experimentation. You just need to do a lot and lot of experimentation around your user experience, whether it's like testing a new feature within your app or working with your user experience. Because there's only like with because if the company is mature enough to have the data already, then I think
Yeah.
experimentation is the thing because you cannot just blindly think that, oh, I know that this is going to happen, so I'm just going to like launch this new feature. This doesn't work that way. Like you need to have like solid foundation in terms of just like making sure that experimentation is critical or very important whenever you roll out new features or you make any changes to user experience. And then based on what experiment gives you the results, I think that's when you use those results to make data informed decision in terms of where should I launch this feature or not.
Oh, um, yeah, yeah, that does make sense. You've worked cross-functionally with products, engineering, finance, and leadership. What usually breaks down when teams try to use data together?
Yeah. I think every team is different in a way, the problem that they solve for. I think eventually everyone wants data, but the stakeholders has a misconception that, okay, it's just like a magic wand and like I can just give the data in like 5 minutes. That doesn't work that way. There's a lot more that goes on back end where we need to think of like the data sources, the different attributes, like how can we make it more presentable to our stakeholders, things like that. And then it's like, okay, now the stakeholder has like a good understanding of the data, but it's never enough because once you start presenting some very simple data to stakeholders, they keep asking for more and more and more, um, which is in a which actually is a good state to be in, but it's more like, it takes time to reach to that stage. It doesn't happen like overnight. So, uh, yeah, I think it's data is more like a kind of gold mine where all the decisions that needs to be made. I know I may sound like more like a broken record, but it is what it is in terms of just like leveraging that because otherwise you'll be making decisions that you wish you did not made.
Yeah,
So
well,
it's like, yeah.
uh, well, looking back, right, how has your definition of impact changed as you've grown in your career?
Yeah, I think my definition of impact um, has not changed, but I always try to, whenever I work on certain things, I always think in my mind, like, okay, how does this actually ties to my company objective? And then also more broadly, like also discuss with the manager in terms of like, okay, how important that particular project is, how impactful is that, right? And there's a you can measure impact in very different ways, right? It could be your revenue based impact. Oh, you worked on this project and this helped your company gain millions of dollars. Or it could be like a cost saving where you help your company reduce like cost by, I don't know, 100K, 500K. Or it could just be more like an operational where, or more like from customer perspective, you help your company's NPS score increased by like from like detractors to like promoters, right? So impact has certain flavors depending on what project you work on. Um, so my definition has not changed. It's always been like along the lines of that, whether I'm helping company gain more money, or I'm saving revenue for company, or am I saving cost for the company, or just removing some operational overheads.
That does make sense. For just as a way of takeaway for listeners, how can they start making better decisions? What would you recommend they do to start making better decisions, especially with data?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's no one simple trick. I think the once you get into this world of data, the more you play with it in terms of like understanding the nuances, the caveats of different data sources, attributes, and uh, what tools to use, because there's so many tools right now, right? Like, uh, and layering on top of that, like your visualization. So I think there's like it's like an onion where you just like keep peeling one layer of the other,
Yeah,
right? But in the end, what matters the most is just like how you communicate your insights, because you could be great at crunching numbers, but if you're not able to influence your stakeholders or not able to communicate with your stakeholders, then it doesn't mean anything at all. Like you
yeah.
might have prepared like the best presentation for your company, but if it's not simple enough, if you're not able to communicate that,
Well,
doesn't matter.
um, I will. I'll put. That's that's great. I think it's go back to the very beginning of the episode, the North Star metric. Once you know what that is, you can then start asking yourself what are the other metrics that influence the North Star metric, and what is the input sources, and just start taking those data. And it's easy to say, okay, yeah, we're growing, we're not growing, or we need to improve, or we need to keep doing what's working. Where can listeners work with you and connect
Oh,
with you?
yeah. So I'm there on LinkedIn, Kuber Jain. So you can find me. I'm a senior data scientist at Headspace. Uh, so yeah, feel free to connect me there. And yeah,
Okay. Do you have a website?
no,
Okay, I'll put the LinkedIn link in the description so the listeners can.
yeah. Thank you, Azim.
Thanks for tuning into Wisdom Journey. I hope today's episode gave you practical steps and fresh ideas to keep moving forward. If you found value, be sure to subscribe and share this podcast with a fellow creator or entrepreneur who'd love to learn too. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter and the link in the description for more resources, experiments, and lessons straight to your inbox. Until next time, keep building, keep learning, and keep walking your own wisdom journey. Yeah.